What if I told you that God was silent for 400 years and that this silence was not abandonment or forgetfulness, but part of a plan that few truly understand? Between the last prophet of the Old Testament and the birth of Jesus, there are no recorded miracles, no new prophecies, not a single direct word from God, only silence, a long, heavy, unsettling silence. And the question that spans centuries is simple, but uncomfortable. Why? For those who believe, God's silence often hurts more than the pain itself, because when God speaks, there is direction. When he acts, there is hope. But when he is silent, doubts, fears, and dangerous interpretations arise. Now, imagine an entire nation experiencing this. Entire generations were born, grew up, and died without hearing a new word from God. Had God turned away? Had Israel been rejected? Or was something much greater being prepared behind the scenes of history? Most people skip over this period of the Bible. It is hardly explained in churches, rarely explored in depth, and often treated as a simple interval between the Old and New Testaments. But this interval hides political tensions, spiritual crises, violent oppression, and a messianic expectation that bordered on despair. The people waited for a deliverer. Empires ruled, faith was tested, and God remained silent. This was not an empty silence. It was a silence full of meaning. While there were no prophets speaking, the world was changing. Kingdoms were falling, languages were spreading, roads were being built, ideas were being shaped. Everything seemed disconnected, but perhaps it had never been so aligned. The real question is not just why God was silent, but what he was doing while he seemed absent. Perhaps you have experienced something similar. A moment when you prayed, asked for answers, sought signs, and heard nothing. No confirmation, no clear answer, just silence. The Bible shows that this kind of silence is not foreign to faith, it is part of it. And understanding the 400 years between Malachi and Jesus can completely change the way you interpret God's silence today. But to understand this, we need to go back in time. We need to look at the last prophetic warning, at the spiritual climate of the time, at the historical transformations that were taking place without the people realizing it. We need to understand why, just when everything seemed to be at a standstill, the most important plan in history was moving forward. And that's exactly where this story begins. Before we move on, I need to ask you for something simple, but something that makes all the difference. If this topic has touched you in any way, please like it now. It's not just a click. It's a sign that this type of content needs to continue reaching people who are also seeking answers. And I really want to hear from you. Comment below. Have you ever gone through a period when God seemed silent in your life? Even though you prayed, waited, believed, without clear answers? Your comment may be exactly what someone else needs to read today. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. Here we explore the Bible from an angle that almost no one shows, going beyond the obvious, revealing hidden contexts, deep connections, and truths that transform the way we see God. Because what follows is not just about a gap between biblical books. It's about what happens when God seems absent, but is more present than ever. When we talk about God's 400 years of silence, it's common to imagine an absolute void, as if nothing were happening between the Old and New Testaments. But the truth is that this period begins in a very specific way, with a final warning, almost like an echo that would resonate for centuries. The last recorded prophet, Malachi, does not end his message with comfort, but with tension. He speaks of spiritual corruption, religious leaders distant from God, a people who still perform rituals but no longer live a true faith. And then, almost abruptly, the prophetic voice falls silent. There is no explanation. There is no farewell, just silence. Imagine how this must have sounded to those who lived at that time. Israel had always been a people accustomed to hearing from God through prophets, signs, judgments, and deliverances. Even in the most difficult times, there was always a voice saying, "Thus says the Lord." But suddenly, that voice disappeared. Years passed. Generations changed. Prayers continued. And no answer came. This silence was not only spiritual, It was emotional. It affected the people's identity, their messianic hope, their very understanding of who God was. And while the heavens seemed closed, the earth was in chaos. Persian rule gave way to the Greek Empire. Alexander the Great conquered territories at a speed never before seen, spreading not only power but culture, language, and philosophy. Then came internal conflicts, oppression, attempts to erase Jewish customs, and the desecration of the temple. All this without a direct word from God recorded in Scripture. For many, this seemed to confirm their worst fear. Perhaps God had indeed turned away. But this is where something profound begins to unfold, because God's silence in the Bible never means absence. On the contrary, often it precedes decisive movements. While no new books were being written, the stage was being set. The Greek language was becoming common throughout much of the known world. Roman roads were beginning to connect distant regions. Ideas about morality, the soul, and eternity were circulating as never before. The world was being shaped for something that could not yet be seen, but that would change everything. The Jewish people, however, did not see it that way. Their expectation was different. They expected a political messiah, an armed liberator, someone who would break foreign rule by force. And the more time passed, the more this expectation was mixed with frustration, revolt, and distorted interpretations of the prophecies themselves. Strict religious groups emerged, others more flexible, some focused only on the law, others on power. Each group tried to fill, in its own way, the void left by divine silence. Perhaps this is one of the most human points in this story. When God is silent, human beings try to speak for him. They create rules, extreme interpretations, expectations that do not always come from the heart of God. Silence tests not only faith, but patience, humility, and the ability to trust even without understanding. And this is not something distant from us. How often, in the face of silence, do we try to rush answers, force signs, or conclude that God is no longer involved? This period between Malachi and Jesus was not a mistake. It was a time of painful maturation, a time when faith had to exist without visible miracles, without famous prophets, without clear manifestations, a time when believing required more than emotion, it required perseverance. And that explains why, when John the Baptist appeared in the desert saying that the prophetic voice had returned, the impact was so strong, the silence had finally been broken. But not in the way everyone expected. When we enter the period between the Old and New Testaments, it is impossible to ignore a silent question that hung in the air. If God is not speaking, who is in control of the world? And this is where many people get confused, because they tend to look only at the closed Bible during this interval, without realizing that history continued to run at high speed outside its pages. God's silence did not mean a pause in history, it meant invisible movement. During those 400 years, the world underwent such profound transformations that, in retrospect, they seem to fit perfectly into the scenario of Jesus' birth. But at the time, none of this seemed spiritual. On the contrary, it seemed only politics, war, power, and domination. First, the Persian Empire lost strength. Then Alexander the Great emerged, conquering territories with almost frightening speed. In a few years, he spread something that would change everything: a common language. Greek came to be spoken in much of the known world. For many, this was just cultural domination. For others, it was a loss of identity. But no one realized that this same language would later allow Jesus' message to spread as never before. After Alexander's death, the empire divides. Israel is caught in the midst of constant disputes. Rulers come and go. Some try to respect the Jewish faith, others try to destroy it. The temple is desecrated. The law is ridiculed. There is real, not symbolic, religious persecution. People die for refusing to abandon their faith. And all this happens while God remains silent. No new prophet arises to explain. No supernatural intervention interrupts the chaos. Only human resistance and faith put to the test. And it is in this environment that something curious happens. The people begin to interpret God's silence as urgency. Messianic hope grows, but it grows distorted. The greater the oppression, the more the Messiah is seen as a military leader, a political king, someone who would trample on enemies and restore Israel by force. The scriptures continue to be read, but now filtered through pain, fear, and accumulated anger. God's silence did not erase faith, it stretched it to the limit. At the same time, a new power emerges, Rome. Unlike previous empires, Rome did not rule only by the sword. It ruled by structure, roads, laws, administration, order. For the first time, distant regions were connected in a stable way. Long journeys became possible. Messages could circulate with less risk. Again, none of this seemed spiritual, but all of this would be essential so that, decades later, the apostles could travel the world proclaiming the gospel. Do you see how God's silence begins to take on another layer of meaning? While the people asked, "Why doesn't God speak?" The world was being organized in a way that would allow. Frankie spoke of Historia. It would not be just a local word, restricted to one people. It would be a global message. But at that moment, no one saw it that way. Silence was still interpreted as abandonment. And perhaps that is the most uncomfortable point in this part of the story. God was acting outside of traditional religious expectations. He was not raising up visible prophets or performing public signs. He was shaping context, culture, language, and paths. And that requires a much more mature kind of faith, a faith that trusts even when there are no clear explanations. This same pattern is repeated throughout the Bible. Before great divine interventions, there are long periods of silent preparation. The problem is that human beings almost never recognize this while they are living through the process. Only later, looking back, does it all begin to make sense. But at that moment, Israel was not looking back. It was just trying to survive spiritually in a world that seemed increasingly distant from God. If the world was being prepared externally, something even deeper was happening within the people. And that is a detail that almost never receives the attention it deserves. Because God's 400 years of silence did not only shape empires, roads, and languages, they shaped hearts, expectations, and interpretations of faith. It was during this interval that Judaism changed decisively. Without prophets speaking on behalf of God, the people had to cling to what they already had. The law took on even greater importance. The scriptures began to be studied more rigorously, more zealously, with more fear of error. Religious groups emerged that you have heard of, but perhaps never stopped to think about why they appeared here. Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, zealots. Each group was born as a human attempt to deal with divine silence. The Pharisees, for example, believed that extreme obedience to the law would hasten God's intervention. If the people were holy enough, God would speak again. So they created fences around the law, rules upon rules, trying to avoid any possibility of disobedience. The intention seemed good, but over time faith becomes heavy, rigid, tiring. God is no longer just the Lord who guides, he becomes the judge who observes every detail, ready to punish. The Sadducees follow another path. They ally themselves with political power, with the existing system. For them, maintaining stability was more important than waiting for a miracle. They deny the supernatural, deny the resurrection, reduce faith to what is controllable. The Zealots, on the other hand, do the opposite. They believe that God will only act when the people take up arms. Violence comes to be seen as an act of faith. They all read the same scriptures. They all claim to serve the same God. But silence causes each group to project onto God what they carry within themselves. And while this is happening, ordinary people suffer. Simple people, who are not versed in theological debates or power games, begin to feel that God is too distant. Faith becomes something mediated by leaders, rules, and rituals. Spirituality loses its personal touch. God's silence begins to be filled by human voices, and not all of them speak with love. It is in this environment that the expectation for the Messiah becomes almost suffocating. But not just any Messiah. It is a political liberator, a warrior king, someone who will finally break the silence with strength, fire, and visible authority. Few can still imagine a Messiah who would come meek, humble, speaking of forgiveness, grace, and inner transformation. God's silence gradually narrows the spiritual vision of the people. And here's something important. God did not remain silent because the people stopped seeking him. He remained silent while the people talked more and more about him. Speeches increased, debates grew, interpretations multiplied, but intimacy diminished. The silence was not an absence of religion, it was an absence of deep relationship. Perhaps that is why, when God finally decides to speak, he does not begin in palaces or temples dominated by religious elites. He begins in the desert, with a man wearing skins, eating, simply calling people to repentance. John the Baptist appears, breaking centuries of prophetic silence, and the first thing he does is not to announce a new system, it is to confront hearts hardened by wrong expectations. But before we get there is something that needs to be understood calmly. God's silence not only reveals who he is, but exposes who we are when he does not respond the way we expect. What do we do when God is silent? Do we create rules? Do we create shortcuts? Do we create enemies? Or do we create space to be transformed? There is an even more disconcerting detail about those 400 years that almost no one notices. God was silent, but heaven was not empty. While there were no prophets in Israel, the spiritual world continued to move. Invisible conflicts, distorted messianic expectations, spiritual ideas mixed with politics, power, and fear were accumulating like heavy clouds. The silence was not a neutral interval. It was a period of growing spiritual tension. During this time, Israel came under the domination of successive empires: Persians, Greeks, Seleucids, Romans. Each domination was not only political, it was spiritual and cultural. Foreign gods, human philosophies, rationalism, mysticism, sophisticated idolatry. The people who had once fought not to worship images now had to deal with something even more dangerous. Ideas that seemed intelligent, elevated, and even spiritual, but which turned the heart away from God. Hellenism, for example, did not arrive by imposing statues by force. It arrived offering logic, reason, progress, beauty, status. Many Jews began to adapt their faith to make it more acceptable to the world. Eternal truth began to be diluted to fit into the dominant culture. And this creates an even deeper kind of silence, when God could speak, but no longer finds ears willing to hear something that confronts them. At the same time, ancient texts begin to be reinterpreted in an increasingly symbolic or political way. Spiritual promises became slogans of national liberation. Prophecies about redemption of the heart began to be read as strategies of war. The expected Messiah was no longer someone who would restore the relationship between God and man, but someone who would crush Rome. God's silence did not erase hope, it distorted it. And here, there is something extremely relevant today, because when God delays, we also run the risk of redefining what we are waiting for. We adjust our expectations to something that seems more comfortable, more immediate, more visible. Israel continued to read the scriptures, pray, and attend the temple, but it no longer expected God in the way God planned to reveal himself. Meanwhile, evil did not stand still. Religious violence grew, fanaticism intensified, armed groups emerged. Children grew up learning that God was distant and angry. God's silence came to be interpreted as abandonment or tacit approval of human excesses. And when that happens, faith ceases to heal and begins to hurt. Perhaps that is why, when Jesus finally appears, he is not recognized by almost anyone who used to talk about God. Silence set the stage, but it also revealed the contrast: who truly longed for God and who merely longed for power, validation, or spiritual control. And here it is worth pausing for a moment, because this question spans centuries and reaches us today. When God seems silent in your life, what do you allow to grow within you in that space? Trust or mistrust? Humility or rigidity? Hope or distorted versions of the truth? There is also a decisive point in these 400 years of silence that completely changes the way this period is viewed. God's silence was, in fact, a process of forced maturation of faith. Until then, Israel had lived for centuries depending on visible signs, prophets speaking, miracles happening, clear interventions. When that disappears, something essential is exposed. Who remains faithful when there is no immediate confirmation? Without new revelations, the people were forced to deal only with what had already been said. The law, the writings, the ancient promises. There was no new word, no divine update. And that creates discomfort, because human beings like spiritual novelty. We like something fresh, something exciting, something that confirms our current expectations. God's silence removed that and left only the uncomfortable question: what do you do when all that's left is to trust? It is in this scenario that groups such as the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes emerge. Each of them is a human response to divine silence. The Pharisees try to control God through rules. If we obey everything perfectly, he will have to act. The Sadducees reduce faith to what is rational and convenient. If you can't explain it, it doesn't exist. The Essenes isolate themselves, believing that the world is too lost to be reached. None of these paths come out of nowhere. They are born out of misinterpreted silence. Notice how this echoes today. When God does not respond, some become legalistic, others become skeptical, others turn away completely. Silence reveals the heart. It does not create crisis, it exposes it. At the same time, something profoundly transformative happens. The scriptures begin to be valued as never before. Without living prophets, the text becomes central. Study deepens. Synagogues multiply. Faith begins to be transmitted within homes, families, and local communities. God's silence forces the people to carry the faith on their own without relying on constant external experiences. And this is not punishment. It is preparation, because when Jesus arrives, he does not find a completely ignorant people. He finds people who know the texts, who are waiting for something, even if in a distorted way. The ground is not dead, it is tense. Dry, cracked, exactly the kind of soil that reacts radically when the water finally falls. Perhaps that is why silence hurts so much, because it does not distract us. It confronts us. It takes away the noise, removes the emotional shortcuts, and forces us to face questions we would rather avoid. Who is God when he doesn't do things the way I expect? Does my faith depend on the answer or on his presence? And here there is something intimate, personal. Many who are listening to this now are not experiencing persecution or imperial oppression. They are experiencing something quieter, unanswered prayers, promises that seem delayed, doors that don't open. And the temptation is to think that this silence means absence. But history shows us something else. God often works most deeply when he seems most distant. There is something even deeper happening in these 400 years that is almost never spoken aloud. God's silence was not just for Israel, it was for the whole world. For the first time in biblical history, it is not just one specific people who seem unable to hear God. It is humanity as a whole walking without a new word from God. And this creates a unique, almost unsettling scenario where everyone moves forward thinking they are in control, when, in fact, they are slowly being positioned. During this period, the world becomes surprisingly prepared. Greek becomes a common language. Roman roads connect distant regions. Trade unites different peoples. Ideas circulate with unprecedented speed. It looks like human progress. It looks like historical chance. But when you look closely, you notice something strange. Never before has the world been so structurally ready to receive a message that needed to reach everyone. And here's the shock. If God had spoken before, the world would not have listened. If the Messiah had come before, his message would have been confined. The silence did not delay the plan, it synchronized the timing. What seemed like delay was precision. What seemed like abandonment was alignment. The Bible says that Jesus came in the fullness of time, not when Israel wanted him to, not when Rome was comfortable, not when the temple was at its peak, but when everything was exactly right politically, culturally, and spiritually. God's silence was the fine-tuning of the clock of history. but it also explains something difficult to accept. God does not run at the pace of human anxiety. While people cried out for quick answers, he was preparing an eternal impact. While many asked for signs, he was building paths. While they waited for a shout from heaven, he prepared a silent birth in a manger. Perhaps that is why silence bothers us so much, because it confronts our urgency. It forces us to admit that not everything revolves around our timeline, that not every wait is a delay, that not every absence is rejection. Sometimes silence is God saying, "Not yet," because it is not yet complete. And that brings us to a sensitive point. How often do we ask for immediate answers to situations that are not yet ripe? How often do we want God to speak before we are ready to listen or obey? Silence, in this sense, is not punishment. It is protection. It is preparation. It is mercy in disguise. When Jesus finally appears, he does not come with thunder. He does not come announcing the end of Rome. He comes speaking of the heart, repentance, the inner kingdom truth that sets free, a type of message that only works after a long period of spiritual frustration. Silence created hunger, and hunger created listening. Perhaps you are experiencing exactly that right now, a time when everything seems to be at a standstill, but something inside you is being adjusted. Expectations are being shattered. Pride is being confronted. Dependencies are being exposed. And that hurts, because maturing almost always hurts. There is still one decisive detail that ties all this together, and it often goes unnoticed. During those 400 years of silence, the way people related to God changed profoundly. Without prophets, without new audible revelations, without clear public signs, faith was no longer sustained by external voices and began to be confronted internally. It was during this period that many learned to live by tradition, and others began to feel a void that no tradition could fill. The temple was still there. The rituals continued. Religious festivals were celebrated. But something was missing: the living presence, the clear direction, the feeling that God was near. And this created two types of people: those who clung even more to religiosity rules, customs, spiritual appearance, and those who began to realize that something was broken in the system. This detail is essential because when Jesus appears, he does not directly confront ordinary sinners. He confronts precisely those who have turned God's silence into religious control. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the spiritual leaders, they all learned to occupy the space left by divine silence. Where God did not speak, they began to speak. Where God did not command, they created rules. Where God waited, they pressed. The silence revealed something dangerous. When God does not speak, human beings try to take the microphone. And perhaps that explains why Jesus' message was so uncomfortable. He did not come to reinforce the system that was born in silence. He came to expose it. You have heard what was said, but I say to you. This phrase only makes sense after centuries in which no one said anything new on God's behalf. Jesus was not just teaching, he was reclaiming the voice that had been stifled by interpretations, traditions, and human interests. But notice something important. God allowed this. He allowed silence to show how far man would go when he tried to take his place. By allowing religion to become heavy, cold, and distant, God set the stage for something totally different. A faith based on relationship, not rules. That's why so many people were immediately drawn to Jesus. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. After 400 years without hearing God, people recognized his voice instantly. The silence tuned their ears. The absence created discernment. The wait separated those who wanted control from those who wanted truth. And this touches us directly, because something similar is happening today. When God seems silent, voices arise from all sides trying to explain everything, control everything, define everything. But not every spiritual voice comes from God. Sometimes silence is precisely the space we need to learn to recognize the right voice when it finally speaks. Perhaps you have already felt this: a spiritual weariness, a feeling that following rules no longer fulfills you, a discomfort that says there is something beyond this. This discomfort is not rebellion. Often, it is the beginning of true listening during those years when no prophetic voice was raised. Many people believed that God had turned away. It was as if heaven were closed, as if the ancient promises had lost their power over time. But silence never meant abandonment. On the contrary, in biblical history, God's silence almost always precedes something too great to be announced before its time. While the people felt the absence of answers, God was acting invisibly, silently, and deeply strategically. Nothing was standing still. Everything was being carefully prepared. Each generation that was born without hearing a new prophecy was part of a larger plan, even without realizing it. Because when God decides to be silent, He is not denying His promise, He is protecting what cannot yet be revealed. The silence became a sacred space where human expectations were broken and hearts were tested. Many began to live only on the memory of old promises, repeating past stories so as not to lose hope. Others gave up thinking that God had changed His mind. But the promise remained alive, hidden not by forgetfulness, but by purpose. There was an exact time for it to manifest, and nothing could anticipate that. Silence acted as a veil, preventing hasty eyes from seeing before the right moment. God was aligning the time, the events, and, above all, the right people for the fulfillment of what had been promised centuries before. As the world followed its course, empires rose and fell, laws were created, cultures mixed, and paths were opened. All of this was part of the necessary scenario for the promise to be revealed in the perfect way. Even without realizing it, humanity was being led to a specific point in history. The silence was not empty. It was loaded with intention, loaded with meaning, loaded with future. God did not speak because He did not need to explain what had already been decided. And perhaps that is one of the most difficult parts of faith, trusting even when there are no visible signs, even when there are no new words, even when everything seems the same for too long. The promise hidden in the silence also had another function: to reveal who truly trusted God and who depended only on immediate answers. Because it is easy to believe when there are clear signs, when miracles are happening before our eyes. But when heaven is silent, only those who understand that God remains God, even without speaking, remain. Silence separates mature faith from conditional faith, and in that seemingly empty interval, God was forming something much greater than an isolated event. He was preparing a change that would span generations, that would redefine the relationship between heaven and earth, and that would only make sense when it finally came to light. Perhaps that is why the silence was so long, because what was to come was not just another answer, another prophet, or another one-off intervention. It was the fulfillment of everything that had been announced before. It was the materialization of the promise that seemed dormant but was never dead. And while no one heard God's voice externally, He continued to speak through history, time, and circumstances. Silence, in fact, was the language that prepared the human heart to hear something completely new when it was finally revealed. And this is where everything begins to get even deeper. Because when God breaks the silence, He does not do so in an ordinary way. He does not return only with words, but with His presence. And this hidden promise, kept for so long, begins to approach the moment when it can no longer remain hidden, when we finally understand that silence was not absence, but preparation. An inevitable question arises that pierces the heart of those who reflect more deeply on the biblical story. If God was preparing everything, why wait so long? Why not send Jesus earlier, when the people were suffering under other empires? Or later, when perhaps the world was more evolved? This question is not new. It has echoed since the early Christians and remains alive today because it touches directly on our own spiritual anxiety. We want quick answers, immediate solutions, interventions when the pain seems unbearable. But God's timing rarely coincides with our sense of urgency. If Jesus had come earlier, much would not yet have been ready. Messianic promises were scattered throughout Scripture, but collective understanding was still fragmented. The people expected a political liberator, someone who would break visible chains, not someone who would confront the human heart. Furthermore, The world was not yet connected in the way necessary for the message to spread. Roads did not connect distant regions. Languages were not shared. Cultures were not sufficiently intertwined. The revelation could have happened, but it would hardly have achieved the reach it did. The before would have satisfied human impatience, but not the eternal plan. And the after, why not wait a few more centuries? Why not choose a time of greater stability, less conflict, more comfort? Because, paradoxically, it was precisely that scenario of tension, oppression, and expectation that made the human heart more sensitive to hope. The world was tired. Religions offered empty rituals. Empires promised peace that never came, and people lived under a constant sense of loss of meaning. It was the exact moment when the promise would not only make sense, but would be deeply desired. God does not come in when everything is comfortable. He comes in when humanity realizes that it cannot save itself. The time chosen was not random, nor convenient. It was surgically precise. Every detail of history converged on that point. The Greek language facilitated communication of the message. Roman rule ensured roots and circulation. Jewish tradition preserved the prophecies, and the previous silence had created a spiritual void that cried out for something true. Everything was aligned, not a second before, not a second after. Because if it had been before, the promise would have been misunderstood. If it had been later, the human heart would already have been hardened in other ways. God's when is as important as his how. This logic directly confronts our way of dealing with faith, because, deep down, the question why not before is also the question we ask when we suffer, and why not later is the question that arises when we are afraid of change. God's timing forces us to trust, not only in the outcome, but in the process. He teaches us that delay is not denial and that waiting is not wasted. Each era has a specific purpose within the divine narrative, and to try to shift that is to try to mold God to our impatience. And this is exactly where this reflection begins to touch on something even more personal. Because the same God who chose the exact moment to fulfill his greatest promise is the God who acts today with the same silent precision. The question is no longer just about the past, but about what it reveals about the present, and what is still being prepared now, even when it seems like nothing is happening. When we think of God's silence, we almost always imagine something external, as if it were just a historical interval between the Old and New Testaments. But in fact, that silence was not only happening in heaven, it was happening within human beings. While there were no new prophets, no new signs, and no new audible words, something much deeper was being worked on. The human heart was slowly being prepared to truly hear, because before God spoke again, human beings needed to relearn how to listen. For centuries, people had become accustomed to a faith based on constant signs, visible intervention, responses. When this ceased, discomfort arose, and discomfort reveals a lot. It exposes how much our faith depends on what we feel, what we see, what we hear clearly. God's silence breaks this superficial dependence and forces an uncomfortable question. Do I believe only when he speaks? Or do I continue to believe when everything seems quiet? This period was not just a test of patience. It was a process of collective spiritual maturation. Without new revelations, the people turned their eyes inward. The ancient scriptures began to be reread, reinterpreted, debated. The wait created hunger, and spiritual hunger is fertile ground for transformation. The human heart, which had previously reacted impulsively, began to develop expectation, not empty expectation, but a deep, silent, almost painful hope, because waiting without visible guarantees shapes the character of those who wait. And God was not only preparing the world to receive Jesus, he was preparing people capable of recognizing him. This silence also exposed false securities. Many realized that their faith was based on traditions, religious systems, and power structures, not on a genuine relationship with God. When these structures failed to provide answers, only emptiness remained. And it is precisely in emptiness that the human heart becomes most sensitive to truth. The Messiah would not come to a heart full of religious certainties, but to hearts that were broken, weary, and hungry for meaning. The silence did not drive away the right people, it filtered them. There is something deeply human in all this, because silence forces us to face who we really are when God does not respond as we expect. It reveals our haste, our fears, our attempts to control divine timing, and at the same time, it teaches us something that words cannot teach: dependence. A prepared heart is not one that knows everything, but one that recognizes its need for salvation. And that is what those centuries built a humanity more aware of its own limitations. When Jesus finally appears, he finds people who already carry too many questions for simple answers. People who knew that rituals do not save, that political power does not free the soul, and that lifeless religion sustains no one. Silence did what speeches could not. It carved out space within the human heart. And where there is space, there is possibility for revelation. Where there is thirst, water is immediately recognized. And perhaps that is why this part of the biblical story bothers us so much, because it looks too much like our own journey. How often does God remain silent? Not because he has abandoned us, but because he is preparing us from within. How often is the absence of answers actually the beginning of a silent, profound transformation, invisible to the eye, but decisive for what is to come? Silence shapes, adjusts, breaks resistance, and creates spiritual sensitivity. It is not empty, it is internal work. After so much time in silence, the break does not come with a crash from the sky, nor with a grand announcement to kings and authorities. And that, in itself, speaks volumes. When God decides to speak again, he does not choose the temple, the palace, or the center of religious power. The silence is broken almost imperceptibly, in a simple setting, far from the eyes of those who thought they controlled faith. This confronts us because it reveals that the problem was never the lack of a divine voice, but where we were looking to hear it. The first sign does not come as a direct answer to humanity's big questions, but as a whisper of hope. An angel appears, an ancient promise takes shape, a child is announced. Heaven moves again, but in an intimate, almost personal way. It is as if God was saying, I did not return to impress, I returned to reveal myself. The silence is broken not to satisfy curiosity, but to fulfill a plan that had been in preparation for centuries, behind the scenes of history and the human heart. There is something deeply symbolic in the way this silence ends. It does not end with an explanation of the previous 400 years. God does not justify the wait, does not defend himself, does not respond to human accusations, he simply acts. His faithfulness does not depend on our understanding. The birth of Jesus is not just the beginning of a new phase. It is living proof that silence was never abandonment. It was gestation. It was invisible construction. It was a promise maturing at the right time. When God's voice returns, it does not come as a distant command, but as an incarnate presence. The Word becomes flesh. The Word is not only spoken, it is lived. This changes everything, because now God does not only speak to human beings, he speaks with human beings, walks alongside them, feels pain, feels tiredness, feels rejection. The silence is broken in such a profound way that communication ceases to be merely spiritual and becomes relational. It is no longer just listen, it is come and see, and that explains why many did not recognize the moment. They expected the end of silence to be a spectacle, but God chose intimacy. They expected a voice that would echo in the heavens, but they received a baby's cry. They expected power, but they received vulnerability. The silence was broken, but not in the way human anxiety imagined, and perhaps that is why this part of the story is so uncomfortable. It exposes our misguided expectations of how God should act. Breaking the silence does not solve everything instantly. On the contrary, it raises new questions, new conflicts, new resistance. Because when God speaks, again, he does not confirm systems, he confronts them. He does not reinforce religious structures, he reveals hearts. The presence of Jesus does not bring easy answers, but a living truth that demands a stance. The silence is over, but now no one can pretend they didn't hear. responsibility shifts. And here is something that connects directly to our own spiritual experience. Because often, when we think God is finally going to answer, He doesn't give us an explanation, but direction. He doesn't give us total clarity, but presence. He doesn't give us control, but invitation. The silence is broken, but not to restore comfort, rather, to initiate transformation. And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to get even more intense. Because what seemed to be the end of the wait turns out to be only the beginning of something much greater. If this part of the video made sense to you, write the words he spoke in the comments. Sometimes, recognizing this helps us realize that God may be speaking right now, even if not in the way we imagined. After going through this entire period of waiting, of apparent silence, of unanswered questions, and of promises that seemed too distant to continue believing in, we arrive at a revelation that completely changes the way this story needs to be understood. God was never silent. What existed was a perceived silence, not a real silence. While humans interpreted the absence of prophets as abandonment, God was working on a scale far greater than any generation could see. It was not a lack of voice. It was an excess of depth. The 400 years between Malachi and John the Baptist were not an empty interval in the history of faith. They were a period of intense, silent, and precise preparation. God was shaping the political, cultural, linguistic, and spiritual landscape of the world so that Jesus' message would reach not only Israel, but all of humanity. The Roman Empire, with its roads, its administration, and its territorial unification, did not arise by chance. The spread of Greek as a common language was no coincidence. Even the spiritual crisis of the Jewish people, tired of empty religion and thirsty for true redemption, was part of this invisible process. While people asked, "Where is God?" He was positioning each piece on the board of history. Kings rose and fell, empires were born and died, cultures mixed. Ancient prophecies became clearer, all without most people realizing that the plan was advancing exactly as it had been determined. Silence was not a sign of inactivity, it was a sign of sovereignty. God did not need to speak to each generation to remain in control. This revelation directly confronts the way we deal with silence today. Because when God does not respond in our time, we tend to think that He has turned away, that He no longer cares, or that our prayers are not being heard. But the history of those 400 years proves otherwise. It reveals a God who works even when He doesn't explain, who acts even when He doesn't announce, who builds even when He doesn't manifest Himself in the way we expect. Silence, in this context, is not punishment, it is strategy. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all this is to understand that God does not measure His faithfulness by our immediate sense of response. He measures it by the perfect fulfillment of what He has promised. Jesus did not come despite the silence. He came because of the silence, because it was during this period that everything was aligned so that when the Word manifested itself, it would not only be heard, but spread, lived, and transformative for the whole world. When we look back, we realize that silence was, in fact, a different language. A language that was not expressed in public prophecies, but in historical events. Not in direct words, but in subtle movements. Not in quick answers, but in deep preparation. God was present in every detail, even when He seemed absent. He was writing history on a level that human eyes could not follow. And that is the final revelation that closes this entire cycle. God's silence was never empty, never neglectful, and never abandonment. It was the space where the greatest plan for human redemption was being carefully constructed. A plan that did not depend on human haste, but on the perfection of divine timing. And when that time came, there was no doubt that God had always been there. If this message spoke to you, write the phrase "He has always been acting" in the comments. Sometimes, saying this out loud completely changes the way we see the silence we are experiencing now. After everything we've seen so far, this story is no longer just about centuries past, and begins to touch something much closer to home. Because God's silence did not remain trapped between Malachi and Jesus. It repeats itself, it echoes, It crosses generations and reaches us. Maybe it reaches you. Maybe this same kind of silence is present in your life right now, in that space where you pray, wait, seek answers, and everything seems too quiet. What if the silence you experience today is not a sign of abandonment, but of something being prepared outside your field of vision? Because the Bible shows us that God was never idle in the 400 years before Jesus. The heavens seemed closed, but history was in motion. Kings were being overthrown, empires were changing, roads were being built, cultures were being mixed, languages were being unified. All this without the people realizing that every detail was part of a bigger plan. Now think about how this applies to your life. What if, while you feel that God is absent, He is rearranging things that you don't yet understand? What if closed doors today are exactly what prevent you from arriving unprepared for something that is still being built? Silence, in this sense, ceases to be empty and becomes a space full of intention, an interval where God works without announcing, acts without explaining, builds without revealing. Perhaps you are waiting for God to speak when He is already acting. Perhaps you are looking for an audible answer when the real movement is happening behind the scenes of your story. Just as before the coming of Jesus, God may be aligning times, people, and circumstances for something that will only make sense later, and that requires trust. Because trusting when God speaks is easy. What's difficult is trusting when He is silent. But the big question that remains is this: what exactly was God doing while He seemed absent? What was happening behind the scenes of history during those centuries of silence? And more importantly, what might He be doing now while you feel He is not responding? That's exactly what we're going to explore in the next video. We're going to open the Bible, look at history, and understand, step by step, what God was building while everyone thought He had fallen silent. Because when you understand what God does in silence, the way you wait changes completely. If you've come this far, it's because this message didn't pass you by chance. Something touched you, something moved you, something awakened within you. And when that happens, it's important to stay connected. So subscribe to the channel now. This content is made for people who don't want shallow answers, but want to understand what God is doing even when everything seems silent. By subscribing, you won't miss any part of this journey. Like this video, it really helps to spread this message to other people who may be experiencing that same silence today and still can't explain how they feel. And write exactly that in the comments. I really trust in silence. If this message spoke to you, declare it. Sometimes, a simple written phrase is a leap of faith that strengthens the heart. And don't stop there. The next video is a direct continuation of this story. What was God doing while He seemed absent? That's where everything starts to make even more sense. Click on the video that's appearing now and continue this journey with me.